In this video, we will be discussing budget ramp options in mono white. To have made it onto this list, the spell must have at least one white pip in its casting cost, and be under $2. This of course will be preventing colorless options like Arcane Signet or Gold Mirror from making it onto this list. I will also preface this list by saying that most ramp options in mono white are very slow, and you may be better served by using mana rocks like Arcane Signet or Marble Diamond. But there is an upside to white ramp, that being that most white ramp is land-based, like green, so that you can trust that you won't lose your ramp if someone plays like a Vandal Blast or some other board type. So with that out of the way, let's move on to the list. Number 10 on this list is the Restoration of Igonjo. For 2 and a white, you get an Enchantment Saga with Chapter 1. Search your library for a basic Plains card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. Chapter 2. You may discard a card. When you do, return target permanent card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Number 3. Exile the Saga, then return it to the battlefield transformed under your control. It transforms into the Architect of Restoration, which is a 3/4 enchantment creature, Fox Monk, with Vigilance, and whenever Architect of Restoration attacks or blocks, create a 1/1 colorless spirit creature token. Chapter 1 searches for a basic Plains card to ensure that you don't miss your next land drop if you don't already have a land in your hand. For Chapter 2, if you have 2 or more lands in your hand, you can discard one of those extra lands, and return that same land to the battlefield. Then play your land's return as normal, essentially ramping you. The second chapter can also be useful for recurring something from the graveyard, or cheating in mana rocks or other small creatures, by discarding it to its own effect. But the fact that this card can only really ramp you if you have extra lands in your hand, and the earliest it can do this is turn 4, earns it a low spot on this list. Number 9 on this list is Aerial Surveyor. For 2 and a white, you get a 3/4 artifact vehicle with Flying, Crew 2, and whenever Aerial Surveyor attacks, if defending player controls more lands than you, search your library for a basic Plains card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. This card suffers from the same problem as the Restoration of Igonjo, where it only begins to ramp you on turn 4. But it does come with the upside that it does stick around, and could potentially ramp you multiple times in a game, especially if one of your opponents is playing green. Next up on the list is Cartographers Hawk. For 1 and a white, you get a 2/1 bird with flying, and when Cartographer's Hawk deals combat damage to a player who controls more lands than you, return it to its owner's hand. If you do, you may search your library for a Plains card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. This card can ramp you starting on turn 3, making it much faster than the previous 2 cards. This card also has the major benefit of not being restricted to searching for a basic land, which means that you can search up any dual or tri-land that has the Plains typing, which is great color fixing for decks without green. However, since the card bounces itself into your hand, it can be difficult to get repeated value from the card, like in the case of Aerial Surveyor, and you also can't keep it as a blocker. For number 7, we have Scholar of New Horizons. For 1 and a white, you get a 1/1 human scout that enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. Then you can tap it to remove a counter from a permanent you control. You can search for a Plains card and reveal it, and if an opponent controls more lands than you can put that card onto the battlefield, tapped, and if you don't, you can put it into your hand. Like Cartographer's Hawk, the Scholar is not restricted to giving you basic lands, giving you great color fixing in white. But unlike Cartographer's Hawk, it is much easier to get repeated value from this card. If you have a deck that consistently utilizes counters, you can tap the Scholar every turn for more lands. In addition, even if you are ahead in lands, or at parity with your opponents, the lands can still go into your hand, which can prevent you from missing your land drops, allowing you to maintain your lead. The Scholar can even be used as a utility piece, removing lore counters from sagas to repeat their effects, or other negative counters from your permanents. The Scholar, however, only really gives all of these extra benefits if you're in a deck that can consistently create counters for him to remove. Otherwise, he is just a one-time effect, and therefore doesn't earn a very high spot on this list. For number 6, I chose Path to Exile, which might be a bit weird, but hear me out. For 1 white mana, you get to exile a creature you control in exchange for a basic land onto the battlefield tapped. We can all agree that cards like Village Rites are pretty good. For 1 black mana and a creature, you get to draw 2 cards, which is a pretty good rate. So why can't we apply the same logic to Path to Exile? For 1 white mana and a creature, you get to ramp 1, which is, admittedly, a pretty good rate. Although, of course, using up one of the best removal spells in the game for the sake of ramping is always going to be questionable in most parts of the game. So unless you're really desperate for lands, you probably won't be doing this, which is why it only earns a 6th spot on this list. For number 5, we have one of my favorite cards, Land Tax at Home. For 1 and a white, Land Tax at Home gives you a one-time trigger of Land Tax, where you get to search your library for 3 Plains cards and put them into your hand, but only if someone is ahead of you in lands. This card is also one of the cards that are not restricted to searching basic lands, making it a great option for color fixing outside of green. But the main problem with this card comes from its play patterns, because the earliest you can play this is on turn 3 before you play your land drop for turn. But the problem with this is that on turn 3, unless you've been dumping your hand on turns 1 and 2, you're likely to need to discard some of the lands that you just drew, making this more of a mid to late game play to make sure that you smooth out your draws as you go through the game. Another problem with this card is that it doesn't actually ramp you. What this card does, and how it gets you ahead of your opponents, is that it prevents you from missing your land drops. So where your opponents might be missing their land drops on turn 5 or 6, you won't, which will put you ahead of your opponents. But in the early game, it won't really do much for you, earning it a fairly low spot on this list. Number 4 is Keeper of the Accord. For 3 and a white, you get a 3/4 human soldier with, at the beginning of each opponent's end step, if that player controls more creatures than you, you create a 1/1 soldier. And if that opponent controls more lands than you, you search for a basic plains and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Once you play Keeper of the Accord, you will never fall behind in lands. If any opponent gets ahead of you in lands, or if you miss your land drop, Keeper of the Accord will make sure that you are at parity with them. Keeper of the Accord also has the possibility of creating 1/1 soldiers if you're behind on creatures, which usually won't be happening if you're in a tokens deck, but if you aren't in a creature focused deck, this card allows you to have consistent blockers throughout the game. So why is a card that can ensure that you never fall behind in lands, and can create consistent blockers for you throughout the game, only the 4th spot on this list? Well, it comes down to its mana cost. This card costs 4 mana, making it extremely slow compared to your other options. This card also never gets you ahead in mana of your opponents, because this card only does something if you're falling behind. So if you're in the leading position of the game, this might as well be a dead card in your hand, because you won't get any of the triggers. Number 3 is Loyal Warhound. For 1 and a white, you get a 3/1 dog with vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you may search your library for a basic plains and put it onto the battlefield tapped. This card is essentially rampant growth if you aren't going first. On turn 3, you can play this before you play your land for turn. The person who went first will have 3 lands, so you can search for a basic plains. Then you can play your land for turn as normal, so now you have 4 lands, putting you ahead of your opponents. Loyal Warhound also has 3 power, making it an excellent blocker for the early game. Number 2 is Legion's Landing. For 1 white mana, you get a legendary enchantment with, when Legion Landing enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 white vampire creature token with lifelink. When you attack with 3 or more creatures, transform Legion's Landing. It transforms into Adanto, the First Fort. It is a legendary land that taps to add 1 white mana to your mana pool, or you can pay 2 and a white and tap it to create a 1/1 white vampire creature token with lifelink. The requirement to flip this card is a very easy one to meet. 3 creatures is not a lot to ask for in white, which is a color that is really good at creating tokens, and the fact that most white ramp is also attached to creatures. Legion's Landing also enters with a 1/1 token, making the 3 creature requirement even easier to meet. Furthermore, once you do flip Legion's Landing, the land comes in untapped, allowing you to use it right away. This means that Legion's Landing essentially paid for itself. So why isn't this card in the number 1 spot? 2 reasons. This card isn't useful in non-creature focused decks. If you're playing a deck that doesn't establish a board state, or you don't have creatures you're willing to throw into combat, then it can be very difficult to flip. Secondly, this card costs $1.98 as of the writing of the script, with a price tag that is certainly going to go up, which will make this card quickly fall out of budget territory. And finally, for number 1, we have Knight of the White Orchid. For 2 white mana, we get a 2/2 human knight with first strike, and when Knight of the White Orchid enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you, you may search your library for a Plains card and put it onto the battlefield. This card is basically a carbon copy of a Loyal Warhound, but with 3 notable differences. First, the land doesn't come into play tapped. So on turn 3, after you pay for Knight of the White Orchid, you get a land in untapped, then play your land for turn. Now you have 2 mana left to play additional mana rocks or other cards, getting you far ahead of your opponents. The second difference from Loyal Warhound is the lack of the basic requirement. So you could search for a card like Prairie Stream and get a dual land into play untapped. Third, Knight of the White Orchid has first strike, making it arguably a better blocker than Loyal Warhound. All of these factors make Knight of the White Orchid an extremely powerful ramp option in mono white, earning it the number 1 spot on this list. So that's it for the list. I hope you found this helpful for building your budget decks, and if you know of any cards that you think should have been on the list, or think that cards should have been in different spots on the list, tell me in the comments. I would love to know.